Claire Williams adjusted her leather bag over her shoulder as she stepped into the private terminal of the sprawling airport. Dressed in a simple navy blazer, tailored slacks, and flats, her appearance was intentionally understated. Today wasn't about making a statement or flaunting her position. It was about quietly inspecting the company's latest acquisition, a state-of-the-art private jet, before its inaugural flight. The sleek marble floors of the terminal gleamed under fluorescent lights, and passengers lounged on plush armchairs, sipping cocktails or tapping away at their devices. Claire's sharp eyes noticed every detail, from the efficiency of the staff to the professionalism of the security team, or lack thereof. "Excuse me, ma'am?" A gruff voice interrupted her thoughts. She turned to find a tall, broad-shouldered security guard blocking her path. His badge read Jack Thompson. His expression was set in that condescending smile Claire knew all too well. "Yes," she replied, keeping her tone polite but firm. "This area is restricted," Jack said, glancing at her bag and then at her shoes. "You need a boarding pass or proper clearance to be here." Claire resisted the urge to sigh. "I'm here to inspect an aircraft." Jack raised an eyebrow, his expression turning skeptical. "Inspect an aircraft? You're joking, right? Unless you're the cleaning crew, I don't see why you'd be anywhere near a plane." The sting of the comment hit hard, but Claire didn't flinch. "I'm the CEO of Blue Horizons Aviation," she said calmly, reaching in her bag for her identification. Jack chuckled, crossing his arms. "Yeah, and I'm the President of the United States. Look, lady, I don't care what story you're spinning. You need to leave before I call backup." Around them, passengers and staff began to take notice. Conversations hushed as eyes darted toward the confrontation. Some whispered among themselves, while others shifted uncomfortably, clearly unsure of whether to step in. Claire met their gazes briefly. No one moved. She held out her ID badge, her name and title printed boldly beneath her photo. This should clear up the misunderstanding. Jack didn't even glance at it. Instead, he leaned closer, his voice dripping with disdain. "I don't know where you got that fake badge, but if you don't leave now, I'm escorting you out. This isn't a joke." Claire's chest tightened with anger, but she kept her expression neutral. Her mind raced. How far would this man go in his arrogance? She opened her mouth to speak, but Jack cut her off. "Hey, you," he barked at a younger security officer standing nearby. "Call Peter Hamilton. Let him know we've got a trespasser in the terminal." The younger guard hesitated, clearly uneasy. "Jack, are you sure? Maybe we should." "Do it," Jack snapped. Claire's jaw clenched. She could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her, the whispers growing louder. "She doesn't look like a CEO," someone murmured. "Why isn't she dressed for a meeting?" another voice added. Claire's heart ached at the familiar sting of judgment, but she stood her ground, determined not to let Jack or the crowd see her falter. "Listen," she said, her voice steady despite the heat rising in her chest. "I'm here on official business. You're making a mistake." "No, ma'am. You made a mistake," Jack sneered. He reached for her arm. "Come on, let's go." "You're leaving." Claire pulled her arm back before he could touch her, her tone dropping to a steely calm. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Jack froze for a moment, his confidence faltering, but then he barked out a laugh. "Lady, you got guts, I'll give you that. But guts won't keep you here. Let's move." He motioned toward the terminal doors, and before Claire could say another word, Jack began ushering her toward the exit. Her cheeks burned as she passed passengers who quickly averted their eyes, pretending not to see the unfolding scene. At the glass doors, Jack finally stopped and turned to face her, smirking. "See? That wasn't so hard. Next time, don't try sneaking into places you don't belong." Claire fixed him with a piercing stare. "You'll regret this." "Oh, I doubt it," he replied smugly, walking away. As the doors slid closed behind her, Claire took a deep breath, her emotions swirling between anger, humiliation, and determination. She glanced at her phone and dialed a familiar number. "Peter Hamilton speaking," came the voice on the other end. "Peter, it's Claire Williams," she said, her voice firm but measured. "I need you to meet me at the private terminal immediately. There's been an incident." Peter's tone shifted instantly. "Claire? What happened?" "I'll explain when you get here. Let's just say your staff has some serious training gaps." 15 minutes later, Peter arrived, his face pale as he spotted Claire waiting just outside the terminal. "Claire," he began, his voice a mix of concern and nervousness. "I had no idea." "Save it," Claire interrupted, her voice cutting like glass. "Where's the guard?" Peter fidgeted. "Jack? He's, still inside. Do you want me to bring him here?" Claire's lips tightened into a thin line. "Yes, and bring your senior team too. We're going to settle this now." Peter nodded and hurried back into the building, leaving Claire to compose herself. She straightened her blazer and inhaled deeply. Whatever humiliation she'd just endured, it was about to be rectified. When Peter returned, Jack trailed behind him, looking slightly confused but still brimming with his earlier arrogance. He didn't recognize Claire immediately, which only fueled her resolve. "Jack," Peter began awkwardly, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." Jack snorted. "You're telling me? This lady was trying to get into restricted areas without clearance. I had to throw her out." Peter winced, glancing at Claire. "Jack, this is Claire Williams. She's the CEO of Blue Horizons Aviation." For a moment, silence hung in the air. Jack's smirk faded, replaced by confusion, then shock. "She's what?" "You heard him," Claire said sharply. "I own the company that operates half the jets in this terminal, including the one I came to inspect." Jack stammered, his confidence crumbling. I didn't know. You weren't dressed." "Dressed like what?" Claire cut him off, her voice rising. "Like someone who deserves respect? Like someone who doesn't need to explain their presence here?" Jack's face reddened as he looked down, suddenly finding the floor very interesting. Claire turned to Peter. "This isn't just about me. It's about the culture you've allowed to fester here. We're going to address this. Publicly." Peter nodded quickly, his face pale. "Of course. Whatever you need." Claire's eyes locked back onto Jack, her tone cold. "And you'll hear from me soon?" Jack opened his mouth to respond, but thought better of it. He nodded silently, his bravado completely gone. As Claire left the terminal, she knew the humiliation she'd endured would only fuel her determination. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The boardroom at the airport's administrative office was far from the luxurious setting Claire was used to. The beige walls, outdated carpeting, and flickering fluorescent lights didn't reflect the multi-million-dollar enterprise that operated out of this space. Claire sat at the head of the table, her presence commanding, though her expression betrayed no emotion. Across from her sat Peter Hamilton, visibly flustered, and Jack Thompson, who looked like he'd rather disappear into the linoleum floor. "Let's begin," Claire said, her voice crisp and professional. Peter cleared his throat nervously. "Claire, first of all, I want to personally apologize for what happened. This was an unacceptable—" "Stop," Claire interrupted, raising a hand. "We're not here to dance around the issue with empty apologies. Let's focus on accountability and solutions." Jack shifted uncomfortably in his chair, glancing at Peter for support. When none came, he finally spoke. "Ms. Williams," he began hesitantly, his bravado noticeably absent. I didn't know who you were. If I had known." Claire's sharp laugh cut him off. "If you had known? Is that supposed to make me feel better?" Jack fumbled. I was just following protocol. It's my job to ensure security. You weren't wearing a uniform or carrying proper identification." "I wasn't wearing a uniform because I'm not a janitor, and I wasn't carrying proper identification because you refused to look at it." Claire shot back, her tone icy. Jack's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Peter looked as though he wanted to disappear as Claire continued. "What you did yesterday was more than a mistake, Mr. Thompson," Claire said, leaning forward slightly. "It was humiliating, degrading, and entirely avoidable. Your actions were not about protocol. They were about perception. Let's not pretend otherwise." Jack's face reddened, but he remained silent, his fists clenching under the table. Peter finally found his voice, though it was shaky. "Claire, I assure you, Jack's actions don't reflect the values of this airport. He'll face disciplinary action, and we're committed to improving." Claire cut him off again. "Peter, I'm not here to listen to vague promises. I'm here to demand concrete changes. Let me make something very clear. The humiliation I faced isn't unique. It happens every day to people who don't fit someone else's narrow idea of who belongs in certain spaces. If your staff isn't trained to recognize and address their biases, then this airport is failing. Period. Peter nodded quickly, his eyes darting to Jack. Of course, we'll implement mandatory diversity training for all employees, starting immediately. That's a start, Claire said, her tone still firm. But I want more. I want an independent review of your security protocols, and I want a public acknowledgement of what happened yesterday. Not for my sake, but for everyone who's ever been treated the way I was. Jack's head shot up. A public acknowledgement? You're kidding, right? That'll ruin my career. Claire's gaze pinned him to his seat. Your career wasn't my concern when you humiliated me in front of dozens of people. Why should it be now? Jack stared at her, his mouth agape. Peter tried to intervene. Claire, I understand your frustration, but a public statement might. My what? Claire snapped, turning her attention to him. Embarrass the airport? Tarnish its reputation? Good. Maybe that's what it takes for you to actually address these issues. The room fell into an awkward silence. Peter shifted in his seat, looking at his notes as though they might save him. Jack, meanwhile, stared at the table, his face a deep shade of crimson. Finally, Claire stood, smoothing her blazer. I've said what I came to say. You have 48 hours to present me with a detailed plan for the changes I've outlined. If I don't see real progress, I'll take this to the press myself. Do I make myself clear? Peter nodded frantically. Crystal clear? Jack muttered something under his breath, but Claire didn't bother asking him to repeat it. She walked out of the boardroom, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. As she exited the administrative offices, she spotted a young man standing near the entrance, his face pale and his hands fidgeting with his phone. He looked vaguely familiar. Excuse me, he said hesitantly, stepping toward her. Claire raised an eyebrow. Yes, I was there yesterday, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I saw what happened. I'm really sorry. I should have said something. Claire's expression softened slightly. What's your name? Elliot, he said, his eyes darting to the floor. I work in maintenance. I saw everything, and I recorded it. Claire's eyes widened slightly. You recorded it? Elliot nodded, pulling out his phone. I didn't know what to do at the time, but I thought you might want this. It's proof. Claire hesitated for a moment before taking the phone. On the screen was a video of her interaction with Jack. Clear audio capturing every dismissive word, every cutting remark. She watched silently, her jaw tightening as the memories flooded back. Why didn't you step in? She asked finally, her tone not accusatory, but curious. Elliot's face turned red. I was scared. Jack's, well, he's intimidating, and I didn't want to lose my job. Claire studied him for a moment before handing the phone back. Thank you, Elliot. This is important. He looked relieved but still nervous. Are you going to use it? I don't know yet, Claire admitted. But it's good to have options. Elliot nodded, giving her a small, apologetic smile before scurrying away. As Claire stepped into her car, she felt the weight of the video in her mind. It wasn't just evidence, it was a weapon she could use to demand change, to hold people accountable. But it was also a risk. How far was she willing to go? She stared out the window as the car pulled away, her mind racing with possibilities. For the first time since the incident, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. The humiliation, the anger, the frustration. But as those emotions swirled inside her, another feeling began to take shape. Resolve. The media room at Blue Horizon's aviation headquarters buzzed with activity. Claire stood at the center of the chaos. Her arms crossed as assistants, PR specialists, and legal advisors debated the messaging of the upcoming press conference. On a large screen behind her, snippets of the incident captured on Elliot's phone played on a loop, each moment more damning than the last. Claire, we really need to be careful here, said Angela Ruiz, Blue Horizon's head of PR. Going public with this video could trigger a media firestorm. The airport's board will push back hard. And if they decide to spin this as an overreaction. Overreaction? Claire interrupted, her voice sharp. Angela, I was publicly humiliated in a terminal that operates our planes. If this isn't addressed head-on, it sends a message that we tolerate this kind of behavior. That's not happening. Angela opened her mouth to reply, but thought better of it. Another advisor chimed in. Claire, What's the goal here? If it's just accountability, we already have the airport's promise to implement training programs and disciplinary actions. If you go public, you're escalating. I want to escalate. Claire snapped, her gaze icy. This isn't just about accountability. It's about setting a precedent. A heavy silence fell over the room. Claire sighed, softening her tone. Look, I know this is risky, but if we back down, what changes? What stops another woman or man from facing the same kind of treatment? This is bigger than me. The team nodded reluctantly, though unease still lingered in the air. The tension followed Claire into her office later that evening. She sank into her leather chair, exhaustion pulling at her limbs. The day's battles had taken their toll, but the fight was far from over. She opened her laptop, pulling up the draft of her speech for the press conference. The words stared back at her. This is not a moment to point fingers. It's a moment to reflect on systemic issues that allow prejudice to persist in places where inclusivity should be paramount. Claire's fingers hovered over the keyboard, but the words felt hollow. She closed the laptop with a frustrated sigh. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. "Come in," she called. Peter Hamilton stepped in, his expression a mix of apprehension and guilt. "Claire, do you have a minute?" "Depends," she said coolly. "Are you here to make excuses or to offer solutions?" Peter winced, but didn't back down. "Neither. I came to talk about Jack and the video." Claire gestured for him to sit. "Go on." Peter hesitated, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Look, what Jack did was inexcusable, but he's been with us for nearly a decade. He's got a family, 2 kids in college. If this video goes public, it won't just ruin his career, it'll ruin his life. And that's supposed to make me care?" Claire shot back. "I'm not asking you to care about him," Peter said quickly. "I'm asking you to think about the bigger picture. If this turns into a media circus, people won't just see Jack. They'll see the airport, the airlines, and you. This could hurt your brand, Claire. Is that really what you want?" Claire leaned back in her chair, studying him. "Do you even hear yourself? You're more concerned about protecting reputations than addressing the root of the problem." "That's not true," Peter insisted. "But you have to be strategic about this. Fighting every battle head-on doesn't always win the war." Claire's eyes narrowed. "Funny, that's exactly what people used to tell me when I was clawing my way up in this industry. And yet, here I am." Peter opened his mouth to respond, but stopped when he saw the fire in her eyes. He nodded silently and stood. "Think about it," he said quietly before leaving the room. Claire sat in silence, her thoughts swirling. Peter wasn't wrong, there were risks to going public. But she couldn't shake the image of Jack's smug face, the humiliation she'd felt under his gaze. Her phone buzzed, breaking her reverie. It was a text from Elliot. "I'm rooting for you, Ms. Williams. Let me know if you need anything else." Claire smiled faintly. The young man's courage, however small, reminded her why she was doing this. The next morning, the press conference unfolded in a sunlit atrium at Blue Horizon's headquarters. Journalists filled every seat, cameras trained on the podium where Claire stood, flanked by her legal and PR teams. She adjusted the microphone, her expression calm but resolute. "Good morning," she began. "As many of you are aware, an incident occurred at one of our partner airports earlier this week. What you may not know is the extent to which this incident reflects deeper issues within our industry." The room hushed as Claire continued, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "When I entered that terminal, I wasn't seen as a CEO. I wasn't seen as a leader. I wasn't even seen as a professional. I was judged on appearances, and I was treated accordingly. This is not unique to me. It happens every day, in every industry, to people who don't fit the expected mold." She paused, letting her words sink in. "Some might say this is a personal matter, but it's not. It's systemic. And if we don't address it head-on, nothing will change. That's why I'm here today, to demand better, not just for myself, but for everyone who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong." Claire glanced at Angela, who nodded slightly. On cue, the video began to play on the screen behind her. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Jack's words echoed through the room, each insult more damning than the last. When the video ended, Claire spoke again. "This isn't about vilifying one person. It's about holding systems accountable. Blue Horizons is committed to working with our partners to implement mandatory diversity training, independent oversight, and clear protocols to prevent incidents like this from happening again. But we can't do it alone. Change requires all of us to look inward and ask, are we part of the solution or part of the problem? The room erupted in applause as Claire stepped away from the podium. For the first time in days, she felt a sense of release. Back at the airport, Jack watched the conference from a small break room, his face pale. The weight of his actions hit him like a freight train. He had thought his job made him powerful, untouchable even. Now, he realized how wrong he'd been. As Claire exited the atrium, a young journalist approached her, notebook in hand. "Ms. Williams," she said breathlessly, "how do you stay so composed after everything you've been through?" Claire smiled faintly. "Composure isn't about what happens to you. It's about how you respond. And I choose to respond with purpose." With that, she walked away, her head held high. The fallout from the press conference rippled through the industry like a shockwave. Within hours, news outlets and social media lit up with coverage of Claire's speech and the damning video of Jack Thompson's actions. The video trended on multiple platforms, sparking heated debates about workplace discrimination, systemic bias, and the responsibility of corporations to address these issues. At the airport, the atmosphere was tense. Staff whispered in hallways, their glances shifting uncomfortably toward Jack whenever he passed by. He had been temporarily reassigned to desk duty, a humiliating downgrade for someone who once strutted through the terminal with unearned authority. Jack sat at his makeshift station near baggage claims, scrolling through his phone. Every article, every tweet, every comment seemed to shout the same message. He was wrong. He was the problem. "Excuse me," a voice interrupted his thoughts. Jack looked up to find Elliot, the maintenance worker, standing awkwardly nearby. "What do you want?" Jack muttered, his tone defensive. Elliot hesitated, then squared his shoulders. "I saw the video, and I was there that day." Jack tensed, his face flushing. "So what? You're here to gloat?" "No," Elliot said firmly. "I'm here because you should know something. I recorded that video. I gave it to Ms. Williams." Jack stared at him, his jaw tightening. "Why the hell would you do that?" Elliot's voice remained calm. "Because what you did was wrong. And because it wasn't just about her. It's about all of us. People like me get treated like we're invisible around here. Watching her stand up to you gave me the courage to speak up too." Jack leaned back in his chair, his expression a mix of anger and disbelief. "Do you have any idea what you've done? That video ruined me. My career is over." Elliot met his gaze evenly. "You ruined yourself, Jack. I just made sure people saw the truth." Jack had no response. Elliot turned and walked away, leaving him to stew in the weight of his own actions. Meanwhile, Claire's office was a hub of activity. Her executive team had spent the day fielding calls from industry leaders, activists, and even government officials praising her for her courage. But not all the feedback was positive. "Claire," Angela said as she walked into the office, holding a stack of papers, "the board's response is mixed. Some are fully behind you, but a few think you overstepped. They're worried about potential backlash from airport partners." Claire didn't look up from her laptop. "Let them worry. I made it clear I wouldn't let this slide." Angela hesitated. "There's also this." She handed Claire a printed email from one of the board members. The words were thinly veiled criticism, questioning whether Claire's actions had been driven by emotion rather than sound business judgment. Claire's eyes scanned the page, her expression hardening. "So, now I'm too emotional." "Classic." Angela nodded sympathetically. "It's the oldest play in the book. But we've got a strategy meeting with the board tomorrow. We can push back." Claire set the paper down and sighed. "Let them say what they want. I'm not backing down." The next day, the boardroom at Blue Horizons was packed. The air crackled with tension as Claire stood at the head of the table, facing a mix of supportive and skeptical faces. "We've all seen the headlines," one board member began, his tone measured. "While we appreciate your passion, Claire, we're concerned about the potential financial repercussions of this situation. Airports are critical partners, and if they feel alienated..." "Alienated?" Claire interrupted, her tone sharp. "If they feel alienated because we're demanding basic respect for our staff and customers, then maybe we need to reevaluate who we partner with. Another board member, an older woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, spoke up. No one is disputing the importance of what you're doing, Claire. But this industry runs on relationships, and you've just put a very public strain on one of our biggest. Claire's jaw tightened. And what happens if we don't take a stand? What message does that send to our employees, our customers, or the next person who's mistreated in one of our terminals? This isn't just about damage control. It's about leadership. The room fell silent as her words hung in the air. Finally, one of the more supportive board members leaned forward. Claire's right. This company's success is built on its values, and those values don't mean anything if we don't defend them. This isn't a PR crisis. It's an opportunity to show the world what we stand for. Claire nodded in gratitude, her confidence bolstered. Exactly. And let me remind everyone in this room, Blue Horizons didn't become a leader in aviation by playing it safe. We became leaders by being bold, by innovating, and by standing firm in the face of adversity. This is no different. One by one, the other board members murmured their agreement. By the end of the meeting, Claire had secured their unanimous support. Back at the airport, Peter Hamilton was facing his own challenges. The airport's corporate office had demanded a full report on the incident, and his handling of the situation was under scrutiny. For the first time in years, Peter felt vulnerable. Sitting in his office, he picked up the phone and dialed Claire's number. "Peter," she answered, her tone neutral. "Claire," he began hesitantly, "I just wanted to thank you for how you've handled this. I know I didn't do enough to stop what happened, and I'm sorry for that." Claire was silent for a moment before replying. "Apologies are a start, Peter, but actions matter more. What's your plan to make sure this doesn't happen again?" "We've already started implementing mandatory diversity training," Peter said quickly, "and we're reviewing all our protocols with an external consultant. I'm committed to making real changes, Claire. I promise." "Good," Claire said, her tone softening slightly. "Because this isn't just about you or me. It's about everyone who deserves better." Peter exhaled, relief evident in his voice. "Thank you, Claire, for holding us accountable." She ended the call, a small sense of satisfaction settling over her. Later that evening, Claire sat in her office, looking out over the city skyline. The battle wasn't over, but progress had been made. Her phone buzzed with a text from Elliot. "I saw the press conference. Thank you for speaking up." Claire smiled, replying simply, "Thank you for helping me do it." As she leaned back in her chair, the weight of the past week began to lift. Claire knew the road ahead would still be challenging, but she also knew she wasn't walking it alone. The weeks following the incident marked a turning point, not just for Claire Williams and Blue Horizons Aviation, but for the entire aviation industry. The video of her confrontation with Jack Thompson continued to spark conversations, prompting companies and organizations to reflect on their own practices. Airports across the country began implementing similar diversity training programs, some even reaching out to Claire for guidance. For Claire, the whirlwind of media attention and corporate meetings had finally begun to settle. The airport where the incident occurred had met every one of her demands. Jack Thompson, after weeks of suspension, had tendered his resignation. Claire's insistence on transparency and accountability had sent a clear message. Prejudice and poor judgment would not go unchecked. It was a crisp morning when Claire returned to the airport for the first time since the incident. She wasn't sure what to expect: stares, whispers, maybe even hostility. But as she walked through the terminal, dressed this time in her signature tailored suit, something surprising happened. "Good morning, Ms. Williams," a security officer said warmly, stepping aside to clear her path. "Welcome back, Ms. Williams," a gate agent chimed in with a smile. Claire nodded in acknowledgement, her heart warming slightly. The atmosphere felt different, lighter, as if the tension that once hung over the place had lifted. As she approached the private terminal, Peter Hamilton was waiting for her. He extended a hand, his expression a mix of relief and respect. "Claire," he said, "thank you for coming." "Of course," she replied, shaking his hand. "I wanted to see the changes for myself." Peter gestured toward the terminal entrance. "I think you'll be pleased." Inside, the improvements were immediately apparent. Posters promoting inclusivity lined the walls, and staff members wore pins reading "Diversity is strength. A group of employees was gathered in a conference room, actively participating in a diversity training session led by a dynamic speaker. Claire nodded approvingly. This is a good start. Peter smiled, though he still looked nervous. We couldn't have done it without your push. And I wanted to personally thank you for not taking the nuclear option with the video. I know you could have done more damage. Claire's gaze turned serious. Peter, it was never about damage. It was about progress. If this airport becomes a model for change, then it was all worth it. Peter nodded, visibly moved. Later that day, Claire sat down with her own leadership team at Blue Horizons. They had gathered to review the company's broader initiatives inspired by the incident. Angela Ruiz was the first to speak. Our new training programs are rolling out across all departments next month. We've also partnered with a nonprofit to create scholarships for underrepresented groups pursuing careers in aviation. Good, Claire said, jotting down a note. And the internal reviews? We've identified a few areas where bias may have played a role in hiring and promotions, Angela admitted. We're working on correcting those. Claire looked around the table, meeting the eyes of each team member. This isn't just a box to check. It's a commitment. If we let up now, everything we've worked for means nothing. Her team nodded in agreement. That evening, Claire finally allowed herself a moment to breathe. She sat in her penthouse apartment, a glass of wine in hand, and reflected on the journey that had brought her here. Her phone buzzed with a notification, a news article featuring an op-ed she had written. The headline read, "Changing the Skies. Why Inclusion Must Take Flight." She opened the article, skimming through her own words. Leadership isn't just about making decisions. It's about making a difference. The skies belong to all of us, and it's our responsibility to ensure they're accessible, inclusive, and welcoming. Change is hard, but it's worth it. As she read, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call from Elliot. "Ms. Williams?" he said nervously when she answered. "Elliot," Claire said warmly. "How are you?" "I'm good." "Better." "Actually," he said, "I just wanted to say thank you. For everything. Things at the airport are different now. People treat me with respect, and I feel like I can finally speak up." Claire smiled. "You had the courage to act when it mattered, Elliot. That's something no one can take from you." "Still," he said shyly, "you inspired me. And I wanted you to know I'm applying for a position in airport operations. Something bigger." Claire's smile widened. "That's wonderful. Keep pushing forward, Elliot. The sky's the limit." The next day, Claire stood in front of her office window, watching planes take off in the distance. She thought of the obstacles she had faced, not just in the past weeks, but throughout her entire career. The humiliation she endured at the airport could have broken her spirit. Instead, it had strengthened her resolve. The changes she had fought for weren't just about one incident. They were about creating a legacy of inclusion and respect. As the sun set over the skyline, Claire felt a deep sense of peace. The fight wasn't over, but she was ready for whatever came next. She wasn't just a CEO. She was a trailblazer, a leader, and, above all, the rightful owner of the skies.